Viggo Ellis had always enjoyed the solitude of the woods. Being a police officer in Poughkeepsie kept him in a constant state of alertness. Too many domestic disputes, too many sirens piercing the quiet of the night. The gym was his usual refuge, a place where he could tune out the world with the clang of weights and the burn of exertion. But sometimes he needed something more. That's why he was here, in the dense Michigan wilderness, rifle slung over his shoulder and the crisp smell of fallen leaves in the air. Autumn in Michigan was something else entirely. The forest was a patchwork of gold, red, and brown, the kind of beauty that seemed untouched by time. He'd come out alone, as he often did, planning to camp overnight after hunting whatever small game the woods offered. The air was cold but not biting, and the sky above was a heavy gray, clouds swirling as if threatening rain. The day had been uneventful, with no sign of deer or even smaller animals. Viggo wasn't discouraged. Patience was part of the game. As evening fell, he found a small clearing and set up his camp. A modest fire crackled to life, its warmth driving away the creeping chill. He sat close, carving the last bite of an energy bar and staring into the flames. His thoughts drifted to an episode of a TV show he'd watched months ago, one about mysterious creatures lurking in the wilderness. He chuckled softly at the memory. Pure fiction, he'd told himself then. But alone in the dark woods, the stories felt less far-fetched. It was well past midnight when he heard the first noise, a rustling, faint but deliberate from somewhere beyond the firelight. He froze, hand tightening around his rifle. Michigan wasn't known for dangerous predators, but the unexpected always had a way of finding people unprepared. Probably just a raccoon, he muttered under his breath, though the hair on the back of his neck stood on end. He swept the edge of the clearing with his flashlight, the beam cutting through the dense undergrowth. Nothing. The sound came again, this time closer. A low, almost imperceptible growl followed, and Viggo's blood turned cold. He stood, the rifle now aimed toward the trees. "Who's there?" he called, his voice steady despite the pounding in his chest. The growl deepened, resonating in his chest like the hum of an engine. Then it stepped into view, just on the edge of the firelight. For a split second, Viggo's mind struggled to comprehend what he was seeing. It was tall, far taller than any human, and its limbs were impossibly long. Its skin was pale, stretched taut over a gaunt frame, and its eyes reflected the firelight in an unnatural gleam. It didn't attack, not immediately. Instead, it stared at him, its head cocking to one side as if curious. Then, with an unnerving fluidity, it melted back into the shadows. Viggo's instincts screamed at him to run, but where? The creature was circling, its movements marked by the snap of branches and the crunch of leaves. He couldn't let the fire die. That much he knew instinctively. The light seemed to hold it at bay, but for how long? As the hours crawled by, Viggo's thoughts raced. He'd heard rumors about the Michigan woods, tales of creatures that defied explanation. Skinwalkers, Wendigos, names whispered in hushed tones by those who claimed to know the truth. He dismissed them as myths. Now he wasn't so sure. The creature toyed with him, its movements deliberate but never revealing itself fully. The sound of its claws scraping against bark sent shivers down his spine. He'd radioed for help hours ago, but he knew no one would come quickly. The woods were vast and his location remote. By dawn, the firewood was nearly gone. The creature had grown bolder, its growls louder, its movements faster. Viggo knew he couldn't stay any longer. Slinging his pack over his shoulder, he doused the remaining embers with dirt and set off toward the nearest road, rifle clutched tightly in his hands. The trek was agonizingly slow. The creature followed, always just out of sight but close enough to keep him on edge. Once, it lunged from the trees, swiping at him with claws that raked through his jacket but missed his flesh. He fired blindly, the shot echoing through the forest, and it retreated with a guttural snarl. He stumbled onto the road just as a truck appeared in the distance. Waving frantically, he flagged it down. The driver, a grizzled man in his 60s, pulled over, his expression wary as he took in Viggo's disheveled appearance. "Something in the woods," Viggo gasped, climbing into the cab. "Don't go back there." The man didn't ask questions, just nodded and hit the gas. As they sped away, Viggo glanced back at the tree line. The creature stood there, its form barely visible in the morning light. It didn't follow. It didn't need to. The image of it was burned into his mind, a nightmare he knew he'd carry with him forever. Later, he would learn about the legends tied to Michigan's forests. Stories of things that walked the line between man and beast, that hunted not for food, but for sport. He would wonder if anyone would believe him, if his story would become just another piece of folklore. But deep down, he knew the truth. Some things weren't meant to be understood. It started on a humid, windy summer evening in Maine, the kind where the air hangs heavy and the smell of salt drifts inland from the sea. I was staying at a small rented house in the woods, not far from the coast, with 3 friends from work: Lila, a teacher; Marcus, an ex-military mechanic; and Sophie, a graphic designer. It was meant to be a getaway, a break from the monotony of daily life in Texas, where the relentless heat felt like it never let up. I missed working with the animals at the zoo back home, but this trip was supposed to clear my head. The house was charming in its rustic way, surrounded by dense trees that swayed and hissed under the persistent wind. By the time we settled in, the sun was setting, casting long shadows that stretched like fingers across the forest floor. The first strange thing we noticed was how quiet it was. No birds, no crickets, just the sound of leaves rustling as though the trees themselves were whispering secrets to one another. As we unpacked, Lila mentioned how Maine was known for its mysterious folklore, stories of strange lights in the woods and creatures that defied explanation. We laughed it off, but Marcus, ever the skeptic, scoffed loudly. "People just need something to blame when they get spooked out here," he said, tossing his bag onto the couch. The day passed uneventfully, though I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. It wasn't paranoia exactly, just that sense of something lingering just out of sight. We grilled dinner outside, and as night fell, the wind picked up, howling around the house in low, mournful tones. Sophie suggested we build a fire in the backyard pit. By the time the flames were crackling, the sky had gone pitch black, the stars hidden behind thick clouds. That's when we first heard it, a sound unlike anything I'd ever heard before. It wasn't an animal cry, nor was it entirely human. It was low and guttural, a sort of growl that sent a chill straight down my spine. Marcus stood immediately, scanning the edge of the firelight with a flashlight. "Probably a coyote," he muttered, though his hand drifted toward the hunting knife on his belt. We all tried to convince ourselves it was nothing, but as the hours dragged on, the feeling of being watched grew unbearable. Shadows shifted among the trees, and twice I could have sworn I saw something tall and hunched, move just beyond the reach of the firelight. Then, in an instant, it was there. Not fully, just a glimpse, but enough to freeze me in place. It was tall, unnaturally so, and its eyes glowed faintly in the dark, reflecting the fire like amber mirrors. Its silhouette was that of a massive dog standing upright, its fur ragged and matted, but it moved with an eerie intelligence. Before anyone could react, it disappeared into the darkness. "What the hell was that?" Sophie whispered, her voice trembling. None of us had an answer, but Marcus insisted we go inside. As we moved toward the house, something slammed into the side of it with incredible force. The walls shuddered, and the sound echoed like a gunshot through the woods. We bolted inside, locking the doors and windows. Marcus armed himself with a hatchet from the fireplace, and I grabbed a heavy flashlight, gripping it tightly as though it were a weapon. We tried to call for help, but there was no signal, and the landline was dead. Sophie clung to Lila, both of them pale and shaking. Marcus paced the room, muttering plans for escape, but none of them felt realistic. I couldn't stop replaying what I'd seen in my mind. Could it have been a dog? A bear? No. It was something else. Something wrong. The creature circled the house, its footsteps audible against the wooden porch. Occasionally, it would let out that same awful growl, a sound that seemed to vibrate through the walls and into my chest. At one point, I caught its glowing eyes through the window, watching us with a cold, calculating stare. It was playing with us, toying with our fear. I thought about the campfire stories I'd heard as a kid, tales of creatures that stalked the woods, dogmen, they called it. Supposedly a beast that was neither man nor wolf, but something in between. I'd dismissed them as nonsense back then, but now I wasn't so sure. We huddled together in the living room, the only place where the firelight offered some semblance of protection. The hours dragged on, and every sound, the creak of a floorboard, the rattle of a window pane, made us jump. By dawn, the wind had died down, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. The creature hadn't left, though. We could hear its claws scraping against the wood outside, a reminder that it was still there, still waiting. When we finally made our move, it was chaos. Marcus led the way, his hatchet at the ready. Sophie carried a long kitchen knife, her hands shaking so badly I worried she'd drop it. We burst out the front door and ran for the car, parked 100 yards away down a dirt path. The creature gave chase, its snarls growing louder as it closed the distance. I don't know how we made it, but we did. Marcus threw himself into the driver's seat, and I barely had time to slam the door before the engine roared to life. The creature slammed into the back of the car as we sped away, its claws raking deep gouges into the metal, but it couldn't keep up. We didn't stop until we reached the nearest town. None of us spoke much after that. What could we say? No one would believe us. But the marks on the car were real, as were the nightmares that followed. Whatever was in those woods, it wasn't natural, and it wasn't done with us. The Appalachian Mountains in spring are a mix of rebirth and shadow. The new green leaves on the trees seem to glow under the pale sunlight, but the dense woods hold a certain darkness, a kind of quiet that feels older than time. I'd always wanted to see the Appalachians, and when the travel agency offered an organized trip to a secluded cabin, I jumped at the chance. A few days away from my small kitchen in Poughkeepsie sounded perfect. I'd been working double shifts at the diner for months, and the thought of clean mountain air was too good to pass up. I wasn't alone. There were 6 of us in total. Carl, a school administrator, had the easy confidence of someone used to giving orders. Naomi, a nurse, had a sharp wit that could disarm anyone. Jen and Tom were newlyweds, their excitement contagious. Then there was Max, an amateur wildlife photographer who seemed thrilled at the chance to capture the beauty of the woods. We arrived at the cabin just before dusk. It was rustic but well kept, perched on the edge of a wooded ravine. The wind was steady, rattling the budding branches, carrying the faint smell of wildflowers and damp earth. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were miles from civilization, a realization that felt both liberating and unnerving. The first night passed uneventfully. We sat around a fire outside, trading stories and laughing as sparks floated up into the dark. The wind picked up occasionally, making the trees groan and creak. It wasn't until the second day that things started to feel off. The woods had gone unnaturally quiet. No birds, no insects, just the sighing of the wind through the leaves. Max was the first to notice. He had wandered off the trail to take some pictures of a moss-covered boulder, but came back pale, his camera hanging limp around his neck. "Something's dead out there," he muttered. He described finding the carcass of a deer, its ribcage torn open, the meat picked clean. It wasn't the sight of death that unnerved him. It was the precision. "No scavenger does that," he said, his voice shaking. Carl brushed it off, joking that Max was just trying to scare us. But I could see the unease spreading among the group. That night, we built the fire higher and sat closer together. The first encounter happened after midnight. I was awake, sitting by the dwindling fire, my mind wanting to memories of my mother teaching me how to cook. She always said cooking was about balance, knowing when to take control and when to let things simmer. The wind had stilled, leaving an almost suffocating silence. That's when I heard it. A low, guttural sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. It wasn't human, but it wasn't entirely animal either. I froze, my hand tightening around the fire poker. The sound came again, closer this time, followed by a rustling in the underbrush. A shadow moved at the edge of the firelight, tall, hunched, with limbs that seemed too long for its body. Chris? Naomi's voice startled me. She had woken up and was standing in the doorway of the cabin. I motioned for her to stay quiet, pointing toward the trees. The shadow was gone. The next morning, we found deep gouges in the wood of the cabin's door, as if something had tried to claw its way in during the night. Carl dismissed it as a bear, but the look in his eyes betrayed his fear. Jen and Tom wanted to leave, but the rest of us convinced them to stay. It's probably nothing, Carl insisted, though his voice lacked conviction. That night, the creature came closer. We heard its heavy breathing outside the windows, its claws scraping against the walls. At one point, it slammed against the door, shaking the entire cabin. Naomi screamed, and Max grabbed a fire axe, holding it like a lifeline. We barricaded ourselves in the living room, the firelight casting flickering shadows on the walls. I remembered reading about the Rougarou during a late-night dive into cryptid folklore. A creature of hunger and rage, it was said to stalk the forests, its appearance an omen of doom. The details were vague, but one thing was clear. Once the Rougarou marked you, it wouldn't stop until it got what it wanted. The third night was chaos. The creature began circling the cabin, its guttural growls echoing through the woods. It wasn't just stalking us, it was toying with us, testing our resolve. We knew we couldn't stay. At dawn, we made our move. Carl led the way, his hunting knife glinting in the faint light. Max and I carried makeshift weapons, an axe and a heavy iron pan. Naomi and the others stayed close, their faces pale and drawn. We ran through the woods, the creature's growls growing louder, closer. It attacked just as we reached the clearing where our cars were parked. Carl went down first, its claws raking across his back. Max swung the axe wildly, landing a blow that sent the creature snarling into the shadows. We pulled Carl to his feet, blood soaking his shirt, and practically threw him into the back seat of the nearest car. The engine roared to life, and we sped down the winding dirt road, the creature chasing us for what felt like miles. Its glowing eyes were the last thing I saw before we reached the highway. Carl survived, though he'll carry the scars for the rest of his life. None of us have spoken much about what happened. What could we say? That we were hunted by a creature from folklore? That we barely escaped with our lives? The marks on the cabin, the wounds on Carl, and the nightmares that still plague us are the only evidence we have. I don't know what we encountered in those woods, but I know one thing for certain. Some stories aren't just stories.